You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Land. This podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts Tiffany Cruikshank and Katja Bartsch as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. Happy New Year. Welcome to 2026 and to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. We love to start the year with a roundup of some of the juiciest nuggets from the previous year's episodes, especially those that you heard weeks or months ago and might appreciate hearing afresh or from a new perspective. But before we go too far back, let's talk about the holidays. If this finds you coming out of the holidays feeling the experience didn't quite go the way you hoped, it's well worth dipping back into episode 148, Support Yourself for a Joyful Holiday, with Dr. Diane Malaspina. In the coming clip, Diane shares a simple but powerful suggestion about how to start changing deep-seated patterns around the holidays.
Absolutely. And I think the other interesting thing about holidays is, usually for many of us, this is something that has been a part of our life from when we were very young. And it's something that's repeated every single year. So there is a level of a pattern that happens. And within that pattern of happening year after year after year, we're also facing past versions of ourselves, these different coping responses that we engage in year after year after year. And so, whatever it is that just the disruption of schedule alone, right, can bring about like some need to have a coping mechanism. And then I think as you get older, then there's like the additive of maybe social events and the additive of, more alcohol and parties and staying up late. And then there's the buildup of, spending money on getting gifts, having, different occasions to wear different outfits to, there's all these different things. And then you add something like travel and you add something like even events at work, that might be different. And all of a sudden, there is all of these changes in a window of time that seem very challenging and very different, and that a lot of energy has to go out with. And then it's an opportunity to look at, well, how do I respond to that? Do I find myself eating more? Do I find myself not nourishing myself and skipping meals and just running around frantically from thing to thing to thing to make sure that I get this checklist of things done and all these gifts, bought and sent out? Do I drink more? Am I trying to numb myself from something? Am I, in like overextending myself and trying to like do everything when I actually might just need to be more discerning about how I spend my time and who I spend my time with and my money and every other flow of energy that we're engaging with at this time of year. So it really could take multiple levels of mindfulness. But my advice isn't to like jump into all of it at once. My advice is to like choose one thing that works for you as you approach the season, and that you think of it ahead of time, like get ahead of it and think to yourself, okay, this is the pattern, this is the yearly thing that comes up for me. And if I just approach it with knowing that that's what comes up for me, that might be enough for this year. And then maybe next year I change my travel window. And maybe the year after that, I participate in a different way. Instead of buying presents, I get together with people for what I call real presents over the gifts of presents, like
Yeah.
giving.
Presence with a C instead of
Yeah.
presence with a T. Yeah, 100%. And you're preaching to the choir here because I am a hermit. I go nowhere. I see no one with my family. We don't do gifts. It's just time, and we all kind of pick the food we like the most, so it's not crazy overindulgence. So you are definitely preaching to the choir here, but I think for all of the people who feel more bound by the weight of tradition and expectation, or people who actually enjoy spending time with other human beings, I'm sure there are plenty of people like that listening to the podcast as well. I love your advice about just picking one thing. So start by really spending some time in honest reflection around what feelings the holiday brings up, trying to tease those apart to think about what bits do I really enjoy and relish and benefit from, what things create more friction or constriction or tension for me. And maybe there's just one of those things that create friction or tension that you can approach with a different attitude this season? Just one thing, just one little thing that will give you that sense of having a little bit more control over what's happening to you as opposed to kind of being put in the spin cycle and then just busting out the other end, a complete mess, ready to start the year over.
Whether it's your holiday habits or your health, the new year is a natural time to take stock. Living with the female hormone cycle can make that process slightly more complex. And while there's a lot more research into female health these days, the picture is still far from clear. In this clip from Research Roundup episode 142, Female Hormones, Immune System, and Exercise, Tiffany and Katja discuss recent research into the influence of female sex hormones on inflammation.
Now we get to the juicy part, the influence on the menstrual cycle, and what does all this mean to the menstrual cycle?
Yeah. And what we see here, as we can see with most other cells in the body, is that immune cells also show receptors or express receptors, for example, for estrogen and progesterone. So those two have been primarily discussed as we talk about menstrual cycle phases or also the menopausal transition. And since they express receptors for female sex hormone, it's not a far reach to hypothesize that changes in female hormone may also impact those immune processes. So that's the general premise there.
Yeah, I think a big finding too, finding those estrogen receptors. I know that was a big one, and now starting to get a handle on, what does that mean? How does that actually translate when we talk about estrogen and progesterone in particular?
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting. That's also where you may have heard specific recommendations on lifestyle interventions or exercise regimens. For example, do train in this phase or do not train in that phase because the inflammatory response may be elevated and so on. So that's kind of what triggered this episode almost, that we have a lot of that info out there. And so the general premise, again, is that estrogen, as I already mentioned, acts or can have an influence on the immune system response and the inflammatory response. And the general thought or hypothesis is that estrogen has more of an anti-inflammatory effect, for example, through expressing certain anti-inflammatory cytokines. So that's the overall, let's say, assumption. However, that may also not be as straightforward as we would like it to be, because there seems to be a so-called dose response effect. So high levels of estrogen, which we find throughout the menstrual cycle or maybe also during ovulation, for example, they are thought to be more related to anti-inflammatory effects. And low amounts of estrogen, for example, also as we see in or after menopause, those are then more associated with pro-inflammatory processes. And that's kind of in line with findings you may have heard of, that menopause is also sometimes viewed as this low-level, low-grade inflammatory process. So that's something that's been out there a lot. So we do find more pro-inflammatory markers in or after menopause specifically. And that's probably because of immune cells themselves. Also, and that's just a side note I wanted to add, we can see that the sympathetic nervous system also is more upregulated in women than in men of that age, and that may also play a role in that. But overall, estrogen is thought to have more anti-inflammatory properties.
Yes, and as a side note, if you're listening to this, if you want more about menopause, we do have a full course on that, just to give you a lot of information and more to work with. Depending on when you're listening to this, we may be running it live soon, or you might have to wait a little bit, but we do run it regularly. So you can check that out on our website, yogamedicine.com.
Yeah, excited for that one.
Yes.
And of course, we will not only talk about estrogen, even though that's probably the one that is most mentioned also in the research, but of course, we'll also talk about progesterone. And interestingly, high levels of progesterone are assumed to have the same anti-inflammatory effects as estrogen. So how is that shown in the research? So in line with that, it was or has been reported, for example, that progesterone A can inhibit the expression of pro-inflammatory cytokines from mast cells, for example. So it basically dials down those pro-inflammatory cytokines that are being expressed by some immune cells. That's one. And then also they may impact pro-inflammatory cytokines directly. It may assume that the second phase of the cycle with high estrogen and high progesterone may pose anti-inflammatory scenarios, basically. But
which is good, but not always good.
Good, but not always good. Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's the first takeaway. Anti or pro-inflammatory is not black or white, good or bad. So it's always the balance. So we'll come to that in a minute. But for example, in response to exercise, there's always after exercise a pro-inflammatory phase that kind of initiates that first part or phase of regeneration, and then an anti-inflammatory wave kind of comes in to find that perfect balance to not overdo that inflammatory process. So it's always about the balance. It's always about that complex combination or complex interplay. So I think that's one takeaway that's really, really important. Also, as you look at social media, pro or anti-inflammatory responses are not per se good or bad. And then they also may be different for someone with an autoimmune condition or someone without such a condition. So it really, really depends. And in many cases, those findings that I'm talking about today, some of them also from cell cultures, we don't 100% know yet how to really translate that into clinical findings. So sometimes we know that from cell cultures, but if that then translates into actual practice and clinical practice, that's more of a question mark.
That somewhat predictable rhythm of hormone fluctuations obviously becomes more complex still during perimenopause. While each person's experience of that phase varies hugely, in this excerpt from another Research Roundup episode, 139, Experiencing Menopause, Tiffany and Katja share some of the findings of a study outlining how common symptom clusters vary during pre, peri, and postmenopause.
Honestly, if we look then at the symptoms that are reported, if you're trying to group them together, you won't be too surprised that in the women who were still premenopausal, the symptoms that they noted were related to the menstrual cycle. That was to be expected. But they also included many women in peri and postmenopause. And they then try to kind of group together some of the symptoms. And it's maybe also not so surprising that in perimenopause, the hot flashes came up, oftentimes then together with vasomotor symptoms. But also they acknowledged, for example, that symptoms such as dizziness or vertigo and some heart specific aspects maybe went together. So, and those are some of the symptoms that are not as often talked about, or they also noted down sexual symptoms, wasn't specified to the like tits and bits what exactly was all included in there, but maybe less libido or other aspects related to sexual function. But it's, I think, great that, and this was published in a well acknowledged journal, that they are including also those less talked about symptoms such as dizziness or sexual aspects in their symptom clusters. And I think that alone already, again, gives you a bit more validation if you're experiencing that yourself, or also in our understanding as yoga teachers or healthcare providers, that we are aware of that broad range and that some of those symptoms may also go together or not, depending on the individual. But we have, or our puzzle piece picture of possibilities of symptoms and experiences becomes a bit more complete, maybe, or a bit more colorful.
Yeah, and I think with this one, it was interesting to see because they actually had, like, for each category, some top symptoms and some like common clusters. So for perimenopause, what were the top symptoms that they had?
Yeah, so that was hot flashes and night sweats, what you would probably have expected, but also fatigue. Fatigue is not as often talked about. And then also headaches and bloating, and those, depending on who your healthcare provider is, they may be taken very seriously or not. And so those were the top 5. So also things that are maybe more on a day-to-day basis. You could ascribe them to other things, of course, also not just to hormonal changes, but those were the top 5 in perimenopause.
Yeah, I
And
think
then
the
in
headaches one was really surprising to me. That was, I mean, to be in the top 5 for perimenopause, I think that's one that doesn't really get associated a lot with perimenopause. So I think that was
Yeah,
interesting.
we have to say that was also within the top 5 of the premenopausal ones. So that's something they came away with, that in perimenopause, you can experience symptoms that are more associated with the postmenopausal phase, but also you can still experience all kinds of symptoms that are more associated with the menstrual cycle. So you're really in between, and you can really experience symptoms that are maybe a
Right?
bit more related to both those aspects. So
We're in that like
headaches
in between phase. Yeah.
we're in the in-between phase.
We're in
That's
the in
it.
between phase. But what were the so
Yeah.
what were the 5 for premenopause? So premenopause was
Fatigue, bloating, cramps, headaches, and anxiety.
so fatigue, bloating, headaches, still in the same top 5 for pre and perimenopause.
Exactly.
Anxiety surprises me that I feel like that would have been a top 5 for perimenopause more than headaches.
Yeah,
But
and we'll see
interesting.
in the next study. And of course, if you're interested about our training, also we will dig a lot deeper into all the psychological aspects. Also, that of course can also play a big role in perimenopause and keeps us aware that it really depends on study design, what kind of measures were being evaluated, and we have to keep that in mind also. So don't take that as an absolute, and be aware that anxiety, for example, or also depressive symptoms can also come up in the later phases as well. And we will see in postmenopause, it is noted as one of the top 5. So in this one study, it wasn't in the top 5 in perimenopause, but in postmenopause, and let me just maybe list the top 5 there. It came back. So in postmenopause, it was fatigue again, hot flashes, anxiety, joint pain, and brain fog. But and keep that caveat, it really at the moment is not a conclusive picture that we can throw over all of the peri and postmenopausal population, because in the study we'll talk about in a minute, we'll see that, for example, some other studies find that brain fog may be more related to the perimenopausal phase, and may then disappear in the later phases of postmenopause for some.
Staying on the topic of female health, autoimmune disorders are twice as common for women as they are for men, and are notoriously difficult to diagnose. In this clip from episode 137, Functional Nutrition with Erin Holt, nutritionist Erin shared what she considers to be red flags that could indicate undiagnosed autoimmune disorder.
This is what I'm thinking, like red flags. Like this, we should look into autoimmunity. They have chronic, ongoing mystery symptoms. They have been sick and struggling for years. They've tried different interventions. Some of them work, but not long term. Like, oh, I started doing this, I felt a little bit better, but then I just kind of ended up right back where I started. They've kind of bebopped around between different practitioners. They've collected diagnoses. So like I was told I had fibromyalgia, and then I was told this, and then I was told this, but they're not really sure like what they've got. They might have multiple food sensitivities or chemical sensitivities like we were talking about before. And so all of this kind of tells me we should potentially be thinking about autoimmunity. And then we also want to think about it from an emotional perspective as well, because these people have been through it. It takes a long ass time for somebody to actually get diagnosed with autoimmunity, like I said earlier, because there's no one test. There's no like one test where you can be like, yep, you've got it. You've got the autoimmunity. And so they kind of just get bounced around from specialist to specialist to specialist. 45% of autoimmune patients have been labeled as chronic complainers. That just breaks my heart. I was there. I was one of them. I was like, dude, I'm just I'm just a hypochondriac. I'm just making this all up in my head, or I'm just like so sensitive. Like, what's wrong with me? So there's this distrust in not only the medical system, but in their selves, in their own bodies. There's this sense of shame that they carry around. Like, why am I so broken? What is wrong with me? So if somebody comes to me feeling that way, I'm like, I always try to meet them at that exact level, because they need to be seen, they need to be witnessed, they need to be validated, they need somebody to listen to their story and actually believe them. So those are sort of the red flags, but then there's also clinical clues on just basic everyday blood work. We can talk about some functional lab testing and deeper dives that we might do if we do suspect autoimmunity or they have a diagnosable condition. But these are the things that I'm looking at, like a standard blood panel that would also lead me to believe that there might be autoimmunity at play. And so if you're listening to this and you have like a recent, comprehensive panel, pull it out and look at this. Low white blood cell count. So this is going to be on every CBC you do, white blood cell count. If it's low, you can suspect autoimmunity. This is just telling us the immune system is exhausted. It's depleted, it's compromised. ANA, anti-nuclear antibody, is a good marker for autoimmune activity in the body. It's a pretty inexpensive test to kind of just throw into any blood work. So you can ask your primary care physician for that. And then there's certain inflammatory markers. Acute phase reactants is what they're called. So when there's acute inflammation in the body, these will be elevated. So this is like a sedimentation rate, a C-reactive protein. You might see it written as HSCRP. If those are high, that's telling us, there's inflammation going on in the body right now. It doesn't tell us where it is, but it tells us that it's there. And so if there's like this cluster of clues that lead me to believe that autoimmunity might be present, then we can do more of a deep dive looking at some of the drivers of that autoimmunity.
Whether we are navigating autoimmune disorder, perimenopause, work or family or financial stress or whatever, it can be a delicate balance to create and maintain personal habits that support robust good health. In this clip from episode 146, Hustle Culture Meets Wellness Sphere, Tiffany and Katja outline how wellness is increasingly being seen as a personal responsibility, for better and for worse.
I think what these have in common to some degree, and we see that in the wellness culture in general, is that sometimes the weight or the responsibility is very much put on the individual. So if you're not engaging in those health practices, or if you're not losing as much weight as someone else is suggesting for you to do, it's sometimes conveyed as if that's your thing, your fault, your responsibility. And of course, that can then, on the other hand side, come with a lot of shame or a feeling of inadequacy. And I think in the wellness realm, sometimes that's exactly what the problem around this conversation is, when morality comes in. So when kind of like a social currency is paid for being healthy or following all these health regimens, and when this feeling of inadequacy or shame can then result, and that can then feel not so nice for the person not engaging in all of these practices, and on the other hand side, leaving someone who's following along every recipe, then maybe coming with a feeling of superiority, and of course that's again not really aligning with any middle path.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can all appreciate, I think everyone who listens to this can appreciate, the benefits that we get from nutrition or biohacking. I think we know how much we can influence our health and even our genetics, our epigenetics, of course. And I think probably everyone listening to this has experienced that. And maybe most people or many people listening have also experienced that extreme of how we can get obsessive about it. And I wrote about this in my first book almost 20 years ago now, how important it is. I had this book that was really about, optimizing your health and looking at all these layers, nutrition and yoga and mindset and home remedies and things, but also remembering that there is an important part of not being rigid around it, of like enjoying some of the things some of the time. And like, there's such a fine line, because it really can spiral out of control and become more of a problem than it is a solution. And it's even like something like biohacking, which can be so wonderful. I think most of us can see how obsessive and restrictive and also problematic it can become as wonderful it is. It's like, again, it's that middle path, and then that superiority that comes from it, and the shame and the judgment, and, the performance aspect of it can be, I think, such a challenging part of it. So me, it's such a reflection of our yoga practice of like that ability to be aware of all the things, but not be overtaken by them, the ability to watch and listen and not be swept away, the ability to make informed decisions. And sometimes that is to have some wine with your friends and have a social outlet, which we know is really important, or to have some pizza, or, especially if you're preparing for athletic endeavors, and, like you need to be able to have that balance for a lot of different reasons, of course. But it's so important. I think yoga for me is such a big part of this and so many parts of our lives, but of like being able to not be swept away with the judgment and the control or the need for control, but to be able to watch and listen and choose, do I want a social evening? Do I need to maybe reel it in so I can feel better tomorrow? How do I find that balance? That's, I think the hard part for all of us.
Tiffany and Katja also dived into this topic in episode 135, Yoga as Personalized Medicine, and offered a theory that while we can benefit from new technology like wearables, it can be a fine line between gathering enough information to take informed action and having so much information that it overwhelms or even replaces our own body awareness. Let's listen in.
I mean, the wearables topic, I think, is certainly an interesting one, and where yoga or any form of mindfulness can come in, because any of us who have some sort of wearable technology or is tracking some sort of lifestyle or health data through any device will maybe be familiar with that reaction to what you're recording, right? So one approach or one example that we've also discussed previously was, for example, sleep. Maybe you're wearing an Oura ring or a watch that is telling you how well your sleep was, and maybe your own perception of that is very different from what your device is telling you, and that will then influence how you actually how sleepy or how awake you will feel throughout the day. So I think that's a really interesting one, that we are also reactive to the data we're then seeing from the devices. And I think that's where yoga, where any form of mindfulness can be so helpful to put that into perspective and to maybe feel first. Let's say in the morning after you've slept, feel first and really get your own baseline, your own internal data, and connect with that before you look at a device. And then maybe just use that to kind of double check, or not even look at that all the time. Maybe just go through a period where you track something, but also don't lose or relearn to really connect with yourself as well. I think that is a very important competence when we are more relying on wearables or have them more available in these days.
I really resonates with me, because it's actually why I had an Oura ring. I wore it for a long time. I learned a lot from it. I loved it. And now I definitely take breaks from it, because it's so easy to kind of look at those numbers and feel a different way. And I think it kind of took me out of myself and out of my own inner knowing and listening and sensing. And although I do think watching that data on sleep can be really beneficial for a while, I do think it's helpful. And obviously this depends on the person, the context, of why they're using it other than this. So, for athletes or other scenarios, it might be more interesting to keep that on long term. But for me, I think it helps to take breaks to keep that inner awareness going that can be lost a little bit. I mean, I'm sure other people sense that as well.
And I think what you just said, I mean, yes, with athletes, it might be part of a bigger story on how we evaluate certain data, but also for someone who's not like an elite athlete. And what also connects with yoga or mindfulness approaches is being intentional with the data. So really being intentional what I'm tracking and why I'm tracking it, and just using every function I have on my device may also not be leading to big results. So really considering what maybe sleep is a thing, maybe sleep is a big topic, and then it makes sense to track that, or maybe other parameters are, but really finding that intention behind it and making that a very conscious choice instead of just collecting everything we can and then doing something with it or not. But also the intentionality of it, I think, also plays a big role.
For me, that speaks to like the obsession behind it, which many people and myself too can have, especially as you start adding data into these wearables where they ask you to like fill in information each day, which can be really helpful to analyzing the data. But I think it can be obsessive. I think probably a lot of people feel that as well. That again, is this all this data that I'm adding to this? For me, this is always the question too, is like, is this useful information for me to collect? And at the beginning, sometimes all of it is because I'm looking at these patterns and I'm trying to watch it over time and I'm watching responses. And so I think when you start using wearables, it can be helpful to do a lot, go like kind of overboard at the beginning to kind of see, and again, paying attention to what's influencing your symptom or your problem area, which again, we could just say is sleep maybe, or something else, or energy levels or recovery or whatever that might be. But then eventually for me, and again, this really does depend, especially with competitive athletes, this might be a different story for some people for different reasons, but I find it to be really interesting to kind of back off of that, whether it's not wearing the wearables or putting less information in and really focusing on the topics that feel most resonate or are most influential on those kind of pain points or whatever kind of symptoms you're working with, and not obsess.
This internal body awareness came up in multiple episodes this year, including episode 133, Yoga and Rheumatoid Arthritis, with Dr. Nikki Tugnet. In this clip, Nikki shares practice options during pain flare-ups and the perhaps unexpected long-term impact that building better body awareness can have.
So let's talk a little bit more about managing flare-ups, which are probably going to occur at some point. So it helps, I think, to be ready for them.
Yeah, no, great question. Yeah, it does. And I don't think I've met any any person with RA that's managed to escape life without a flare. So they do happen, and they're very frequent in the beginning, I think, before there's control of the inflammation. Um, and I think bearing in mind the symptoms that we talked about, like the fatigue and exhaustion, the heaviness in the body, I think when we know that there's a flare, we really want to kind of down regulate and just not be too concerned about the physical practice side of things. That's
So we're
really
not doing
important.
a spicy standing flow. We're not doing 108 sun salutations.
No.
Duly noted.
Yeah, yeah, and again, depending on how the RA affects them, there are plenty of people with RA who can go and do a big sun salutation standing practice, and they may not have difficulties with their knees and wrists. They may be okay, and it can be hard for them to know what they shouldn't do, and I would say, I'm going to come back to my favorite expression on the whole of yoga. If we teach them the value of chair yoga early on, then they know, even if they are able to do full on mat based asana practice normally, they know that when they have a flare and they really want to keep moving, they can do it in a chair. They can rest the painful knee or whatever it is, the painful foot or the ankle, and they can still do stuff in the upper body without stressing those joints. So I like to introduce that early on for people. If you're trying to introduce chair yoga for the first time when they're having a flare, there might be some resistance to it.
Yes, I think if somebody's having a flare and you're working with them for the first time, you just want to say to them, where's the most comfortable place for you? Where are you most easy? And if that's sitting in a chair, great. I've got a heap of things we can do sitting in a chair. Is that lying back on a bolster? I got a heap of things we can do lying back on a bolster. So if you start them where they're happy and comfortable, you're going to take a lot of issues off the plate right from the get-go.
Yeah, yeah, totally right. And the other thing I think, which is great for flare, and this is what my clients tell me when I teach my little sort of arthritis class, is that yoga nidra is wonderful actually. So again, it doesn't have to be a big long 60 minutes. Maybe you're working one-to-one with somebody and you make it a 15 or a 20-minute yoga nidra. But I think we provide the opportunity for that person to actually rest. So many people, especially people with RA and autoimmune, struggle to actually rest. It is, really just an not a intrinsically easy thing to do. And people think they're resting, but they're not. They're watching TV or they're, thinking about something. So a little yoga nidra for a time of flare, a really helpful practice as well.
And I mean, I've worked with people for whom the flare up, as frustrating and challenging as it can be, becomes sort of this potent indicator of, it's like an early warning sign. They get the beginning of the old thing back again, and it's like, okay, that's my sign from my body that things are a little bit out of whack. And I've got to kind of dial things back, down, regulate my system, down the stresses a little bit. It can actually become empowering to somebody who has tools to manage it, because it's an unignorable early warning sign that the way things are going needs to change a little bit. And usually not night and day change, but I just have to put a little bit more love and energy back into my mind and body again. And it can become part of the cycle, I've found, of empowerment, of people taking charge of their lives and how they feel, and not just a negative, oh, here we go again thing.
Yeah, that's a great point. I agree. I think that's actually really useful for anybody who's living with chronic pain or chronic illness, not even just restricted to RA, but especially those, illnesses which do wax and wane, which can, where a person can feel completely healthy and then they do have a bad flare up, which might last from days to weeks. And it's just knowing how to slow down, but still be able to um, have the optimism that you'll get through it, that it's not the end, that you're not going all the way back to square one. Um, so those sorts of slower based practices, I think, are wonderful for flares. The other thing I would say is that if a person's got really uncontrolled RA, lots of inflammation, lots of pain, I mean, the sense of a body awareness, that sense of interoception is probably not very strong. Yeah. So again, the more we do those slower practices, the more we help them connect and maybe start to recognize those warning signs of flare a little bit faster.
Here's the challenging thing about interoception, though. Most of us need to be taught how to tap into it. In this excerpt from episode 132, Interoception Research and Yoga, with Valerie Nopick, PhD, Valerie shares how there is a cognitive component to interoception, which means that different students need different approaches to connect to this subtle sense.
That was one of the big things that I took away from this, is that there's a cognitive aspect to all of this. And that makes sense to me, because I think of interoception it's something we feel, but for me, I have to think about it in order to get in my body to feel it. Does that make sense? I mean, you and I were
that's our
chatting
job
about this,
from the yoga teacher perspective. If it were just easy for people to know how they felt and to respond accordingly, I'd be out of a job. That's pretty much what I'm doing all day, is getting people into a state where they can safely notice how they feel and make good choices. That's my job.
Yes. And if we can become more attuned to better cueing or different ways to help people, because that's the beautiful thing about humans too. There's so much individual variability and differences, and a cue that you might say to one person might completely resonate, but saying that same exact cue to another person might not. And so how can we just think about creative ways that we can help our students tap into this practice, and also to help them just embrace the fact that it's a practice, and it just takes that repetitiveness, that continued practice. Like you're going to the gym and you're building, I always think of Tiffany, like it's the same thing as building a bicep, like you have to continue to go to the gym and lift weights if you want to get your bicep bigger. You have to continue to sit down and try to meditate if you want to get better at meditating, or, think about, can you feel your heartbeat? You need to do that every single time, every day, before it will just be something that is a little bit more I don't know, routine for you to do. And just part
And
of,
I guess the
yeah.
other side of the equation that I always love to point out when I'm teaching is it's really appropriate here in this place while you've got an hour or however long set aside to spend this time going, where do I feel my weight exactly in my foot? And if I lean just a tiny bit to the left, how does that change things? It's not appropriate to spend that level of attention on interoception out in the world. Imagine if you're trying to drive your car, or buy groceries or work with all of that attention diverted elsewhere. It's unrealistic and it's inefficient. So it's I guess it's a really important skill, but it's not one that we have to be practicing 24/7. Just like you can't be doing bicep curls 24/7, gym bros.
Yeah.
Here's your second big takeaway. You can't be doing bicep curls everywhere. There's a time and a place for it. And the more honed the skill is, the easier it is to tap into that information when you need it. But, this is why people who are stoned aren't that helpful out in the real world 24/7, because you can't always have that level of, wow, man, look at my hand. Look at how miraculous this hand is. You've got other stuff to do. You've got things to get through. So it has its time and its place. And I do think this is important because when we're teaching and we're teaching people this skill and how amazing it is, and as you said, we need reminding every time, it's also important to remind people that, hey, there's a reason why you're not doing this 24/7 out in the real world, and that's because you've got other things to do.
True. Yes.
But if you can, you're having a heated conversation with your child or your partner, and you can spare just a percentage of your brain power to go, wow, I can really feel my temperature increasing, my blood pressure increasing.
Yeah.
I can feel my responses increasing in emotion. Could I just take a moment, take a breath, and down regulate that reaction somewhat to give me a better chance to manage this conversation in a way that's effective? You can tap into that skill when it becomes more honed as you need it, even in the busyness of the day.
100%. So, yeah, I think that while the article was more tied to interoception and its role in our pain management or pain response, I think it has a lot of connections to our stress response, our emotional responses, the things that we do every single day. You get annoyed with somebody who cuts you off when you're driving to and from the store. And I think the more that we recognize our physiological, our internal responses, the more that we can say, wait a minute, I'm going to take a step back and just pause before I blurt out something that I don't mean, or, act in a fit of rage, have some kind of physical outburst because I'm so angry. I think that those tools are just so valuable for us to be better people in the world and in our communities.
I 100% agree. As I was reading through, it's pretty focused on physical pain, but I was seeing all of the takeaways to mental pain and emotional pain as well. And I mean, if that doesn't just describe the human experience, I don't know what does. Thanks perhaps to this cognitive component, interoception can be particularly difficult for people who have experienced traumatic brain injury, or TBI. In this clip from episode 147, Love Your Brain, Excerpt Insights on TBI with Kyla Pierce, PhD, Kyla talks about the importance of rebuilding body awareness after TBI and offers yet another way to tap into it.
There's a big emphasis on interoceptive cueing, and certainly alignment focus from a safety perspective, but much more around rebuilding a sense of that sensory connection to how people are feeling internally. And what I found to be really helpful in our teaching team and teachers do out in the real world is use something that we call cognitive preparation cues, which basically means before cueing of movement. So say somebody was standing in Tadasana or standing, and the goal was to invite people to lift their arms out towards the sides. So instead of from Tadasana, naming, as you might just simply lift your arms out towards the side, first sharing an interoceptive cue like notice the weight of your fingertips. Sense the touch of air on your skin. Is there warmth or coolness? As you're ready, lift your arms up towards the sides.
Mhm.
And so just that extra step of adding an interoceptive cue brings cognitively someone's attention to that part of the body, and then it organizes more efficiently than the movement. So that's been a really helpful technique, I think, for teachers who sometimes, if you have more of a vinyasa background and are, using very floral or creative cueing, to simplify by just noticing a sense and then the direct cue around, lift up towards the sky as far as feels comfortable for you.
Yeah, super helpful. And I can imagine if your thoughts and attention are sort of anywhere in the room, anchoring them to sensation in the relevant body part first just sort of creates a funnel of attention so that there are now less things for you to focus on and less things for you to think about. And you just feel your hands, your fingers, or your feet, I presume, if you're about to do something standing. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I love that. I can see why people enjoy it. As yoga teachers, I think we all try to offer multiple pathways to the destination we're creating for our students. But it's not always easy to balance clarity and conciseness with the room for personalization. In this clip from episode 144, The Power of Language, Tiffany and I talk about how we aim to negotiate that balance when it comes to our verbal cues. The first big bucket of language choices is around inviting language versus commanding language. And they both really have their place, but they will create a completely different feel.
Yeah. And again, there's not a right or a wrong here. We've all done the commanding language. And I do think it's our place. Like, Iyengar can be one of those that feels a little bit more commanding. But there is something calming about like that specificity of just being like, really clear and specific about what you're doing. And so it's not that I don't think there's a place for this, but I do think commanding language doesn't leave a lot of margin for individuality and, differences or, people choosing what feels important for them. For me as a teacher, I think one of the most important messages I like to convey is to empower my students to be their own teacher, to know that only they know what the pose feels like or what they're feeling like or what their energy's like, or, the whole situation that is their life that's come to this moment and how they feel in this moment. And no one else can know that. And so no one else can make these decisions for them of modifications or whether to stay in a pose or come out or how to breathe. There's so many things in this practice. And I think commanding language just doesn't leave room for that individuality. And that ability to really encourage your students to be their own teacher and make decisions for themselves.
So if we think about specific examples, commanding language would be something like step your right foot behind your right thumb, turn your back foot out 45 degrees, lift your torso and bend your front knee until your front thigh is parallel to the mat. Precise, very clear, very directive. And there is, as you said, some people really respond to the simplicity of that. This is what the shape is, but it doesn't leave space for, my back foot doesn't turn out 45 degrees, or that hurts my ankle, or when my front thigh is parallel, my legs are 6 feet apart and yours are only 3 feet apart. It doesn't leave room for individual variation in anatomy or in experience or in tiredness or in sensation or experience. And so there is a clarity and simplicity to it, but there's not a lot of room for, I'm not feeling the way I think I'm supposed to be feeling when I look the way I'm supposed to look.
And let's be clear, as a teacher, there are going to be some times when you're just say, step your right foot forward.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think we can get carried away with this. I've been in classes too, where people almost use too much and there's too many questions and options and, it's overwhelming. So there is a place for language, which is clear, which is just step your right foot forward, and have it be succinct and simple. I think the trick is kind of knowing your class a little bit, and as a teacher, where to invite, where to just be clear.
And that more invitational language, the examples I can think of are see how it feels to, or you could do X, you could do Y. So creating a little bit more space. And you're right, if you're teaching a flow like that every single time,
it's going to be so fuzzy for the students. Like maybe you step your right foot forward. If it feels good for you, you could ground your back heel. If you'd like to, you could lift your torso a little way or a long way. You know, you can see how you could create a scenario where the student's like, just tell me where I'm supposed to be and I can figure it out from there. So my usual approach is, the first time I'm going through a flow, if it's movement, I'll provide a few options. You know, you could keep your back knee down, you could lift your back knee, you could bend the front leg a little or a lot, you could have your hand on the front knee or on your hips or at your heart or toward the ceiling. But once we're in a rhythm, I'm just cueing, as you suggested, right foot forward, lift your torso a little or a lot, turn your back foot out, spread your arms, you know, so that they know I've got, within that overall scaffold, I've got options, but I know where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think with the invitational language, it's more of like questions. I'm inviting them into the conversation, which is, again, putting them in the driver's seat to decide what they want to do, you know. So, you know, see if, try this, like sense into, feel it, you know, like I'm asking them to also notice, you know, see if it feels nice to reach your right arm forward, you know, see how it feels to lift your left arm up. And yeah, and again, if I do that on all of them, you know, you just be like, well, we're just all over the place, like which sometimes can be interesting if it's just like one of those classes where you're like, today is less about what you do and more just about feel. I don't know. There's a place for everything.
There's a place for everything. But yeah, for me, it requires a little bit more time. So it's either the first time through a movement flow or it's in a pose that I'm staying in for a little while. There is a time and place for everything, not just in the kind of language we use when we teach, but also in the kinds of sequences we create. We often talk on the podcast about the benefits of moving and loading our bodies in varied ways. But there are also benefits to moving our bodies in ways that are predictable and repeated, as you'll hear in this clip from episode 134, ADHD and Yoga with Emily Mariola. You mentioned how important the sun salutation flow is for that sort of imposed discipline. These are the shapes we do. This is the rhythm we do them in. This is the order we do them in. And can you get yourself to do it every class, whether you want to or not, whether you feel ready or not? So talk about that sort of discipline, that tapas aspect of having a prescribed flow.
I should also say I've taught plenty of classes without a sun A or B, so I'm not opposed.
It is possible.
I do think it's there for a reason.
Sure.
Why? Because is the question why? Is that what you're asking me?
Just talk about it more was the question. So take it wherever you want to.
Particularly for people with ADHD, pattern behavior, whether it be get up, brush your teeth, you know, take a shower, put in your contacts, whatever the pattern is, can set you in motion. And if getting going is a struggle, if that doesn't have to be decided, you can use the pattern to create some momentum.
I love that. You're overcoming decision fatigue by taking some of the decisions off the table. These are the things we do.
Right. And ADHD people really tend to struggle if the pattern gets interrupted. So, you know, the big joke on social media is nothing ruins an ADHD person's day like having a 3 p.m. appointment. So, you know, as soon as the pattern's interrupted, it's like you have to start all over again. You can't pick up where you went off. So transitions are really, really hard. They're really hard for kids, especially emotional transitions and time and space transitions. So an A and a B helps you practice a pattern beyond maybe your interest level or even your energy level. And that's just training, right? That's the practice. You do it when you don't want to, and you do it regardless of how you feel, and learning that that's possible. And that sometimes at the end of that, you've gained a little momentum is a good thing to know. Now,
and I'm taking it as a teacher, you don't even necessarily have to say that in a class.
No.
It is its own proof. The student feels that I've done the thing. I didn't have to think about it. It was just the thing that I do here. And now the ball's kind of rolling. I'm already into it. Once you see yourself do that in one context, it becomes possible to do it in others, whether you as the teacher point to it really obviously or not.
Right. And for me, and then, after that portion of class, there's nothing I love more than a, super creative flow. And, people that I know in our studio that have ADHD, because obviously this is something we've talked about here, they really start to thrive. They tend to really like that creative part. They tend to like try things that I'm not even saying. They're doing a handstand and I've got everybody else in down dog. And, I don't mind that either. I'm like, let's do the pattern work. And then it's a free for all. You can do whatever you want. I'll support, but let's do this first. Let's brush our teeth first,
Yeah. Sequencing and language choices aren't the only complexities we yoga teachers face. It can be difficult to balance what we need to do to make a sustainable living with the kind of work that really fuels and fulfills us. As you'll hear Tiffany and I discuss in this clip from episode 130, when should you not teach? And I almost feel like there are two different scenarios here in this sustainability piece. One is a sort of schedule or timetable one of, do you keep teaching the late class on a Monday night and the early class on a Tuesday night? Or you've got 2 daytime classes that are close enough in time that you can just get there if the traffic lights are right and you maybe speed a little bit on that one stretch of open road. Those are the questions that, I often teach in the 200-hour teacher training to say yes to everything, say yes to every opportunity that comes up. But there is a time where your schedule is full and you're going to start feeling the temptation to, and I would suggest that you follow that temptation to make the schedule a little bit more reasonable, assuming you have other alternatives like one-on-one clients or workshops or something else to fill that income gap. Start to think about the pinch points in your schedule of where you feel really rushed and pushed, or where you're not quite getting enough downtime to recharge between classes, or the drive is too intense, or any one of a number of things. So the schedule piece is one that definitely I think happens, different times for different people, but somewhere between 6 months or 2 years into teaching, if you're teaching full time and you've said yes to everything, eventually your dance card is going to be too full and you'll need to start trimming back. The second piece is more about that energy balance of what you're putting in versus what you're getting out. And I know that sounds really transactional, and I don't mean it that way at all, because every class and every student requires an output of effort. It's a job. You do have to put in time planning a sequence or researching their injury or, looking at your options. You've got to spend time getting to a space and tidying it up. You might spend time checking in students, tidying up the space afterwards. There's always going to be an output. But I feel like when a class or a student is well aligned with you, you get fulfilled mentally, intellectually, emotionally. You feel like you're doing good work, even though you might be tired or, whatever. There is a payback to you in terms of satisfaction and fulfillment, a feeling that you are adding to the good in the world, for want of a better way of saying that. And sometimes that's not the case. And that could be because the class just isn't a good fit for you. And the example I always think of in my own mind here is when I was first teaching heated power vinyasa. And it wasn't something I'd practiced before my teacher training. It kind of came up after. I don't do well in heat, and I'm not a real yoga workout person. And so I had a sort of brief infatuation with, I can sequence with arm balances. That's kind of fun. Or I can go from this really fancy bind to, another really fancy bind, or what's a really difficult way I could transition from that pose to that pose. And in the short term, it was a good creative sort of challenge. But after time, gosh, that got tiring. Having to come up with something fancy and new every single week, having to remember it in this room where I was dripping with sweat and blotchy and greasy and not handling the heat very well. And also looking out into the room at a group of mostly office workers who were real type A's and were probably already pushing themselves too hard and really didn't need me cracking the whip for another 90 minutes at night. That was where the equation for me didn't balance. It wasn't the time of sequencing or getting there. It wasn't the time to check students in or clean up the space. It was that feeling of, I'm putting in all this effort and I don't feel like I'm doing anything useful or helpful or worthwhile. So that's where, for me, the energy imbalance became unsustainable.
where I would
Yeah.
have to really crank up the music on the way there to generate enough motivation to teach. And then afterwards, I'd be completely wasted, so wiped out, because there was that internal conflict of, I don't think I'm doing good here.
Yeah, it's that mismatch. I mean, I think it's so important to teach what you love.
Yeah, what you believe
yes,
in.
At first we're just taking everything. We're getting experience. We're connecting with students. We're building as a teacher. But for anyone who's been teaching more than a few years, I think it's really important to be really honest with yourself and what you like, what's important to you, what you're drawn to share as a teacher, and then being really clear about as much as you can in the description. I know some studios have generic descriptions for different classes for all the teachers, but I think really matching up what you love with what you're doing is really important, and trying
For
to
you
avoid teaching
and for
the
the
things you're not
students as
interested in.
well, because
Yeah.
they deserve to have a teacher who's excited to be
Yes.
there and believes in what they're offering and is, stoked to sequence the next class for them.
I mean, there's a time and a place to fill in on an emergency for someone, a
course.
class that maybe you don't love. And that's such a gracious thing to do as a teacher, because yoga studios are challenging and it can be challenging to fill in those spots. And so, but for your regular classes, I feel like the word authentic has become such a catchphrase. I try not to use it, but it really fits here. Really teaching what is authentic to you. And for me, that's always been so important, is, sharing things that I found with my patients. I would see patients all day for, and go and teach an evening class. And my inspiration would be the things that I saw coming up with a lot of my patients physically or mentally, or stress that I was feeling in people. And, it felt really meaningful to me to be able to share that, as more preventative maintenance kind of stuff. But yeah, it can be so draining to teach something that you're not really genuinely interested in. So
yeah.
Returning to episode 146, Hustle Culture Meets Wellness Sphere, for our final clip, Tiffany and Katja talked about some of the shifting cultural and commercial pressures yoga teachers are navigating right now. And Tiffany had a positive note to leave us on.
I think the yoga landscape over the last couple of years has changed in that really trendy part of our yoga scene or population, I think, has really changed. The trends now are moving more toward weightlifting and muscle mass, and so a lot of the really trendy handstands and flows. And I think yoga as an exercise has probably changed in popularity. I think yoga as a therapeutic is continuing to go up. So as yoga medicine teachers, probably feeling that a little bit less in the therapeutic world, because there's still more research coming out and the need is only increasing. That's not going to go away. I think yoga fills a really important role that kind of nothing else can really fill in our kind of health and wellness space.
Tiffany went on to conclude in this episode, as she has in others, that our role as yoga teachers is to serve our communities in ways that we can sustain. Our aim for this podcast is to help you achieve that end, whether by unpacking recent research, platforming experts in their field, or sharing more personal conversations on the issues we all face in these changing times. That's it for this episode, though there were so many awesome conversations that we didn't have time to feature here. Do dip into our back catalogue, get in touch to suggest new topics for us to explore, and please continue to join us. We have lots more juicy and informative conversations to come.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you liked the show, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com. Check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine, or you can email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being part of our Yoga Medicine community.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.